this part of the world, you know as well as I that geography is destined.
From 1979 revolution to the current blockade, the Iranian people have been the silent victims of every policy failure.
This is a brutal, authoritarian, repressive regime that tortures, imprisons, and murders its own citizens.
History shows that cruelty and suppression have an expiration date.
You saw Russia undergo a transition under reformers, Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and yet the consolidation of the state reasserted itself under Vladimir Putin.
President Trump announced that he's planning to hold the blockade for another couple of months.
I think a blockade is sustainable for another couple months. I wonder, though, whether or not the Iranians, in an effort to break out of it, wouldn't consider escalating against the one area in the Gulf that they have not yet attacked comprehensively.
When the locals are being suppressed mainly by militias brought in from Iraq and Afghanistan, how does a population move from seeking change to achieving it?
If there's any promise of regime collapse, it will not occur in the middle of a war. It will occur when the folks who are running the country, who control the oil, the money, and the guns, begin to confront, as they've confronted in the past, all of the challenges that the Iranian public, fractured economy, angry, resentful public, a regime that has lost, probably for the vast majority of the Iranian people, has lost its legitimacy.
Welcome back. Today we are joined by a man who has spent a quarter century in the room where it happens, serving 6 Secretaries of State and navigating the most complex peace negotiations in modern history. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and voice of sober historical clarity in a world of loud opinions. But beyond the titles, he's a student of human nature and the endurance of nations. Aaron David Miller, it's an honor to have you on Beyond the Summit podcast.
Thanks, Amir. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. You have spoken about how the Islamic Republic, above all, a survivalist entity, historically, air campaigns and economic blockades haven't successfully toppled regimes. But right now, with the Strait of Hormuz at play and the economic pressure reaching an absolute boiling point, does the old survivalist playbook still work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is whether or not we've reached a proverbial boiling point. The political scientist William Zartman talks about what he describes as a herding stalemate, when both sides believe that attaining victories is extremely difficult, and yet neither side has been brought to the cusp of realizing the pain they're under would push them to consider a diplomatic pathway out of this. I don't think we've reached a herding stalemate yet. I think both the United States and Iran, number one, believe that their respective pain thresholds are capable of absorbing more pain. I think both have the conviction that they have escalatory steps that they can continue to take. So I don't see it at this juncture. No, we're beginning the 3rd month of the war next week. University of Chicago and Uppsala in Sweden studied every interstate conflict since 1815. The average length of an interstate conflict, wars last much longer, is 3 to 4 months. So I don't foresee this conflict, war, however you want to describe it, as ending anytime soon. I think both sides are still determined to find a way out that would hand them a post-conflict victory. And I think that's really critically important in the case of Iran. I don't think the Iranians are interested in restoring the status quo ante. I think they want to create a new security and a political reality in the post-conflict period, and that has been driven by their weaponization of geography. And in this part of the world, you know as well as I that geography is destiny.
Right.
So I think that has been, in my judgment, the most potentially transformative aspect of this campaign.
What would be the rational next step by either side, in your opinion?
I think Trump already told Axios today, Barack Ravid of Axios, that he intends to keep the blockade U.S. blockade on. And he used an expression, which, in my judgment, for an American president to publicly say to a Muslim country, an Islamic regime, that the blockade has got them, quote, choking like a stuffed pig, unquote. To have an American president use language like that, even though this is a brutal, authoritarian, repressive regime that tortures, imprisons, and murders its own citizens, that's really quite an extraordinary phrase.
My deepest concern, Aaron, is the people of Iran. From 1979 revolution to the current blockade, the Iranian people have been the silent victims of every policy failure. After the brutal crackdowns that we have seen recently, you have mentioned that, with tens of thousands of lives lost, is there anyone in Washington actually advocating for 90 million Iranians, or it's the end game is strictly about regional stability and oil price?
I mean, I don't think this administration cares much about human rights, democratization, the well-being. I think that Trump's vision of the Middle East is epitomized by the Gulf. The Gulf states to him represent everything that's of value in life. He's dealing with authoritarian powers who repress and suppress their own citizens. He's an authoritarian personality, much more comfortable with the MBSs and the MBZs of the world than he is of America's European democratic allies. The Gulf represents money, oil, hydrocarbons, AI, crypto. You see that his best friend, Stephen Witkoff, launching this World Liberty Financial Enterprise. You see Jared Kushner, Affinity Partners, being bankrolled by the Saudis to the tune of $2 billion. I think this is what Trump cares about. It is interesting that he was probably the first American president during the extraordinary, bold, and courageous demonstrations by the Iranian people in January to offer encouragement. He said, help is on the way, seize your institutions, we're going to hit them hard. And yet he failed to deliver because, as you pointed out, the civilians, other than those Lebanese who have suffered as a consequence of Israel's prosecution of its war against Hezbollah, the individuals who are suffering, as many as, I don't know what the death tolls are, in the range of 2,000 civilians,
Right.
Iranian civilians, since February 28. And schools, hospitals, those have been exceptional strikes, but they're still far too frequently. So, yeah, I think they're the ones who are caught up in it. And I think that whatever rationale the administration uses as to how prosecuting this war against the regime could free up the Iranian people, I think, frankly, had Trump found his Iranian Delcy Rodriguez amidst some of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps elites, had he found a pragmatic ideologue to do business with, he would have cut a deal. And he would have left the forces of repression, as he's done in Venezuela, intact.
Yeah, it reminds me, a quote from your colleague Karim Sajjadpour. So the having another Kim Jong-un is more probable than...
Right. He looked for an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, and Karim said that he has found an Iranian Kim Jong-un. And, it's interesting because when you talk to Karim about where Iran is going, of all the various models, China, Pakistan, Russia, Karim thinks Iran is going toward North Korea. Heavily ideological, militarized regime. What it's missing, why the North Korean model isn't exactly accurate, is with the killing of Ali Khamenei on February 28th, replacement by his son, Mujtaba, who would have needed, under any circumstances, several years to find his footing and gain legitimacy. The fact that he was presumably badly wounded, according to reports, he hasn't yet found that. So Iran does not have an Ali Khamenei, which is one of the reasons I think you have decision-making. And again, Amir, I'll apologize in advance. I'm not an expert on Iran. I don't play one on TV. I learn from those who follow Iran on a day-to-day basis. But most Iranian experts believe that in eliminating Ali Khamenei, they have removed the balancer who was capable of figuring out a way to harmonize the respective divisions and factions that exist in any polity, and certainly exists in revolutionary Iranian policies. So that's another constraint if you are looking for the regime to make decisions.
So that disconnect that you mentioned between Washington's interests and the people's reality brings us to the current strategy, the mindset behind the decisions. You understand the Washington mindset better than anyone. In your view, what is the U.S. getting fundamentally right about current crisis? And what is the one critical blind spot that keeps them from seeing the long-term solution?
I think I would have argued to you before Trump that I was relatively astute at reading the mindsets of the Republican and Democratic administrations that I worked for, Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, and even the ones that I didn't. But Trump represents a completely unique persona on domestic, where I think the damage is really being done to the American Republic. The unkindness, the cruelty, the way in which Trump is undermining effective constitutional governance in America is unprecedented in American history. It's an aggrandizement of presidential power we've never witnessed before. And I say to people, the word I, the pronoun I, is only used once in the U.S. Constitution. And I thought to myself, when someone asked me the question, why did the founders, the drafters of the document, use the pronoun I couldn't figure it out. I should have. It's there because the founders embedded the inaugural oath that the president takes in Article 2 that deals with presidential powers and the office of the presidency. And they did it to remind the holder of the office that they are subordinate to the principles of the document and to the popular sovereignty that gave rise to it. Trump has no sense of moral self-governance. He cannot control or sublimate his personal ambitions, his ego, his vanities, his financial and political interests to any concept of public virtue. So it's hard to describe his mindset analytically, I think, and it follows along with his, I think, view of reality, which doesn't go much beyond his own self and his prejudices. I think he looked at Venezuela, he looked at the power of the U.S. military, and I think he became convinced that an overwhelming show of force, joined with the Israelis, would have to cause the regime either to fracture or to become compliant. So I think he underestimated the coherence and resilience of the regime, and he overestimated, as it wouldn't be the first time. And I'd give you Hamas, Hezbollah as examples of the degradation by the Israeli military of Hamas's and Hezbollah's military capacities have still, maybe much to their surprise, not to mine, left Hamas as the preeminent Palestinian actor in the 47% of Gaza they control. And Hezbollah, although hollowed out and much weakened, no longer Iran's billion-dollar proxy, nonetheless, Hezbollah retains capacity to intimidate and deter, certainly the Lebanese government, from moving against it. Right. And it remains a significant challenge for Israeli residents of northern Israel. So the overestimation of military power somehow is a means to create political outcomes. I think that is the one takeaway on the geostrategic level policy.
Right.
That the administration, I think, fell into wrongly, or the president himself.
I hear what you say, 100%. But looking from Iranian people perspective, so as you mentioned, President Trump is the the first and only US president that publicly and openly mentioned that help is on the way. And Iranian people saw that as the first time that US interests in the region is aligned with what they asked for and they protested for, to have a normal life. And they still believe that job is not done until President Trump, US mainly, finishes what he has started by replacing this regime, by helping the process, by facilitating, still they are really hopeful in that regard. And they always ask, finish the job. That's what they see, and that they don't like to be left alone. So what happens, economically they were in trouble before this war. Right now it's 100 times worse, we can say. What is the end game? This is how they see that.
Yeah. I can't imagine if the war stopped today, I think it would be quite clear. The regime, the successors that are left in the wake of the largely Israeli decapitation strategy, I think are going to have to deal with an embittered, angry regime that's going to want to repress even harder because they will be perceived to be somehow weaker. They're going to preside over a destroyed economy, assuming this does not end in a negotiated settlement, which frees up billions of dollars of frozen assets and sanctions relief. I think if you're going to see divisions in the Iranian elite, that's the time that they're going to appear. Now, what could those divisions actually lead to? I have a very hard time understanding this, because without a coherent political opposition that is very well organized and funded and capable of pressuring the regime to the point where elements within the security establishment begin to question whether or not the repression is in their interests, I don't see how you produce a new regime or elements that would somehow be more pragmatic and liberal and open up the system. I don't see how that actually works. And we've seen what happens in authoritarian societies when, in fact, they do crack. I mean, you saw Russia undergo a transition under reformers, Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and yet the consolidation of the state reasserted itself under Vladimir Putin. And Russia is hardly democratic. It's different than it was under the Soviet Union. So I don't know, and there aren't that many examples of authoritarian regimes. Hungary is not Iran. It's in a liberal democracy. Orban was corrupt. They had elections that were actually, even if they were tainted, they were largely fair and free. So you saw a transition there. I don't know how you'd move from 47 years of Islamic clerical and IRGC rule to something else.
So
you can't beat something with nothing. And outside pressures, certainly an air campaign, which is what we've been conducting, is not the history on this is pretty clear. You can't fundamentally change a regime from the air. You have to.
How about this maximum economic pressure? What do you think of this one?
I mean, I think that if the blockade were sustained for 6 months, you could probably break the Iranian economy. 90% of Iran's imports are seaborne. You'd cut Iran off from its, almost $2 million of revenue, 2 million barrels of oil a day. You'd cut it off from paying imports. You'd end up with hyperinflation. But even that, you'd have to question how you get from that to a new political constellation of forces that would put the country in a more liberal democratic path.
That's a critical question. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't see how it actually works, and there are not that many examples.
You mentioned a great point, transition. So history shows that cruelty and suppression have an expiration date, but the quality of that transition matters. So, based on the patterns of history you have studied, what does a successful transition look like for Iran that doesn't result in another 40 years of chaos?
You see, that's what I mean, I wish I could offer you a clear pathway out of this. You have in the Middle East, in the Arab world, and Iran is not an Arab country, but it is still part of that region. It's interacting with that region. You had something called the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring, without exception, and remember, the Arab Spring really was, in many respects, a demonstration of what I'm talking about, because in the case of Egypt, you had the factions within the military basically conclude they could not repress and oppress public demonstrations. So Mubarak had to go. But when Mubarak went, since there was no third way between, other than militarists, the military, or the Islamists, which was then Mohammed Morsi, and the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, there was no third way opposition that offered a more inclusive, pluralistic, I'll say liberal or democratic pathway forward. And in Tunisia, the same thing happened. Ben Ali was removed, and yet you had a greater consolidation of presidential power at the expense of any sort of democratic afterlife. In Yemen, Abdullah Saleh was removed, and you have a fractious, failed state. In Iraq, Saddam was removed, and that was done as a consequence of the two longest wars in American history. Now, Iraq may well be, of all, and we don't know what's going to happen in Syria. You have Ahmad Shara, who appears to be quite pragmatic. I'm sure Syrians prefer Shara to the Assads, but Shara is no Democrat. But maybe Syria will prove to be the one exception to the transition that you're talking about. I mean, Iraq is not a failed state. It's a state with enormous challenges. Sectarian tensions, large parts of the country not under the control of the central government. But it's better than it was under Saddam. So, I mean, in the Middle East, that's about the best.
We can argue, Aaron, that there are many aspects of Iran that makes it different from those countries that you mentioned. Geography,
Many
history,
aspects.
culture, so
Absolutely.
demographics. So
Iran doesn't have the sectarian divisions either. I mean, there are different minority groups, to be sure. But what I can't figure is how, if you're not talking about an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, that is to say, a pragmatic ideologue who cuts a deal with the U.S., but Iran is still an authoritarian, very repressive society.
people don't want that.
Right. Exactly. They want to have freedom. They want to be able to choose.
100%.
And I don't know how to give them.
The complication here comes from the fact that you often said that U.S. cannot fix these problems. And Middle East, this is your sentence. I really like that. Middle East eats up all the ideas about transformation. So, and the locals must lead. But when the locals are being suppressed mainly by militias brought in from Iraq and Afghanistan, how does a population move from seeking change to achieving it without becoming a casualty of geopolitical proxy war?
I mean, I don't think I have a clear pathway for you here. Cuba is another example. I don't, Raul Castro's 94 years old. It's a very coherent set of elites that's governing the country. Trump is going to be looking for a Cuban Delcy Rodriguez in Havana. Maybe he'll find it with one of the younger Castros, one of the grandnephews or the grandkids or the sons of Raul. Freedom House will tell you that since 1950, there are only 22 countries in the world that have maintained their democratic character continuously. and Turkey is not on the list, and neither is India. The creation of a democratic polity and the maintenance of that polity. I mean, Iran has politics. It had constitutional politics. It has civil society. And yet, the word I would use in terms of changing of the regime is sclerotic. It's stuffed and constrained. And I just don't see how you break that pattern.
So it's economic pressure at this point. You mentioned President Trump, announced today that he's planning to hold the blockade for another couple of months. At the same time, this maximum pressure campaign, I think economically they're collapsing, Islamic regime. I see it is collapsing, but the transition with low cost, that's something I cannot, imagine, as you mentioned, how it's going to happen. This is the serious, real question. And if China and Russia do not provide financial and diplomatic floor for Iran, do you think Iranian regime can sustain this much pressure?
I mean, I think it'll come first at the expense of the public, right? I think if the pressure got that intense, to borrow a phrase from the late Ayatollah Khomeini, that this regime would drink the poison, would actually come to the negotiating table. Because Trump wants, I mean, he may say he's got all the time in the world. He wants a way out of this. And if the economic pressure became so intense that the regime felt it had to restore its revenue by opening up, by getting rid of the blockade, I think they'd come to the table, but they would negotiate a issue. They don't negotiate on the nuclear issue. They'd come to some agreement, a moratorium, some constraint on enrichment, but the regime itself is not going to change. What you need is a period of relative quiet where the regime had to fundamentally manage all the expectations of the public amidst a wrecked economy, tremendous destruction, physical destruction in the country. The memories of what happened in January to thousands of Iranians who were killed, imprisoned, and tortured. Then you might be able to see cracks beginning to appear. Whether or not a political opposition in Iran could take advantage of that is beyond my capacity to know.
Right. So this brings us to the ultimate question of sustainability. No one can hold a pressure cooker shut forever without exploding it or leaking. So Washington seems to be operating on a strategy of improvisation right now. Given your 25 years of experience, how sustainable is a U.S. naval blockade? Because we see the global economic impact has already started.
It's not if we're talking oil at $150 a barrel. Not if we're talking. See, at some point, the oil markets and the financial markets will begin to realize that a diplomatic solution is not around the corner. Then you're going to end up with a lot of pain. And while the U.S. can insulate itself better than most countries in the world, it can't hermetically seal itself from a global recession. So I think a blockade is sustainable for another couple months. I wonder, though, whether or not the Iranians, in an effort to break out of it, wouldn't consider escalating against the one area in the Gulf that they have not yet attacked comprehensively. And that's oil export facilities, producing facilities, and export facilities.
They already warned that today so our patience has a limit.
Right.
Okay.
So it may be, but I just don't want to raise expectations. You could get a move back to the negotiating table, but what it won't produce, at least not now, are the sorts of political reforms that are required, to free an entire people, or at least to give them choices, which they do not have now.
Is there anything that you think is critical at this moment, especially for policymakers at Washington to hear? And if they were listening to you, what would you tell them?
I mean, I would remove the block. Well, this is running against, if you, Amir Golshani, have an interest in keeping the blockade on so that the pressure on Iran would increase, the regime might fracture, or you'd end up with a situation on which I can't even imagine a new regime, then what I'm about to say is it won't be music to your ears. I think that the war needs to end, and the straits need to be reopened. The blockade needs to be removed, and the Iranians and Americans, not on the cell phone, not on not through intermediaries, not on the back of a cocktail napkin, need to sit down and begin to talk through the issues that would allow a diplomatic off-ramp to take root. Because my own sense is, if there's any promise of regime collapse, it will not occur in the middle of a war. It will occur when the folks who are running the country, who control the oil, the money, and the guns, begin to confront, as they've confronted in the past, all of the challenges that the Iranian public, a fractured economy, an angry, resentful public, a regime that has lost, probably for the vast majority of the Iranian people, has lost its legitimacy. It is under those circumstances, maybe with additional focus by the international community in the United States on what Washington can actually do to support an opposition movement. It's under those circumstances that maybe you could begin to see really tough choices and fractures occur. But even under those circumstances, I'm not sure how you move from an authoritarian repressive regime to one that is significantly less so. And we use the word transition, so did I, because that's what you need. It's not like a light switch that's going to be turned on and off. You're going to get a transition. If you're lucky, you'll get a Yeltsin or a Gorbachev.
Let's not talk about uranium nuclear program and many other missile program, many other things that are unresolved. But that's for another discussion. Aaron, thank you so much for being with us today.
Amir, great questions. It was a pleasure.